A founder incorporates in Delaware, expects a simple annual obligation, and then sees a franchise tax number that feels completely disconnected from reality. The first question is usually emotional. Why is Delaware so expensive? Why are they charging this much? Is this normal for early-stage startup? And in many cases, the real answer is not that Delaware is punishing the company. It is that the founder does not yet understand how the tax is being calculated. Because a lot of Delaware franchise tax pain is not caused by business success, profit, or even operating scale. It is caused by misunderstanding the mechanics.
Delaware franchise tax is not the same thing as federal income tax. It is not a tax on profit. It is a state-level obligation tied to the corporation's status in Delaware. That is why even a startup with little revenue, no revenue at all, or very early operations can still have a Delaware franchise tax obligation. Delaware is not asking whether you had big profits, it is asking whether this corporation exists within its legal framework and what the applicable annual obligation is under that framework. The most common overpayment story starts much earlier than tax season. It starts at incorporation. A founder uses a standard startup template. The company authorizes a large number of shares. Nobody stops to think how that may affect the Delaware calculation later. Then, the tax notice shows up and suddenly the founder feels like the system is irrational. But the real issue is usually that authorized shares were set without understanding how Delaware's default tax logic interacts with that structure. So the overpayment is often not a random surprise. It is the delayed consequence of choices made at formation without enough context. Delaware corporations can run into two different calculation approaches. One is the authorized shares method. The other is the assumed par value capital method. The default logic many founders first encounter is the authorized shares approach. That is why companies with a high number of authorized shares can see tax amounts that feel wildly inflated relative to the actual stage of the business. But Delaware also provides the assumed par value capital method, and in many startup situations, that alternative method can produce a much lower number. This is exactly why founders should not look at the first tax figure and assume that is automatically the economically sensible result. The mechanics matter. The method matters. The classic startup mistake looks like this. A new company is formed the way everyone does it. A large share authorization is used because it feels standard for venture-style equity planning. Nobody explains the Delaware annual tax effect clearly enough. The founder later sees the notice and thinks Delaware is simply penalizing ambition. But that framing is too simplistic. The state is not reacting emotionally to your cap table. It is applying a calculation method to the structure on file. That is why this topic is less about tax drama and more about structural literacy. If you are using Delaware startup architecture, you need to understand the moving parts early, not after the notice arrives. The right moment to think about franchise tax is not when the deadline is next week. It is when the company is being set up. How many shares are being authorized? Why that number? What assumptions are being made? Will someone later understand the calculation method well enough to avoid defaulting into an unnecessarily expensive result? The goal is not to memorize formulas. The goal is to understand that Delaware corporate design has consequences, and those consequences do not wait until the company is large. Franchise tax is not just an annoying annual bill, it is part of Delaware's corporate architecture. Delaware remains attractive because it offers modern and flexible corporate law, a respected judiciary, and deep investor familiarity. But none of that means the state is simple in the naive sense. Delaware gives founders a very usable system. At the same time, it expects that system to be understood properly. When founders choose Delaware, they are not buying a label. They are entering a rule set. And franchise tax is one of the clearest examples of what happens when someone wants the benefits of the jurisdiction without really learning the operating logic behind it.
Delaware is not automatically expensive, but it can become expensive very quickly if the founder does not understand how the calculation works. So, before the next tax season becomes a problem, review the share structure, review how the tax is being calculated, and do not assume the first scary number tells the whole story. Because in Delaware, the cost is often not the system itself. The cost is misunderstanding the system. And in the next video, we zoom out from one tax mechanic to the bigger jurisdiction question. If founders are rethinking Delaware in 2026, are Texas and Nevada real alternatives or just louder ones?